Hi everyone, David Fazzino here, and welcome back to the final screencast of Anthropology and World Problems, Solutions and Sustainability, Part 2 of 2. And we're going to start off by discussing Ogawa's work, looking at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster and the response from the Japanese citizenry to that, as well as the Japanese nuclear power industry, or the nuclear village. So nuclear power before the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant provided Japan with about 30% of its electricity. There were a total of 54 reactors, and the plans were for over 50% of the energy demands by 2030 to be met by nuclear power. The nuclear village in Japan is essentially an assemblage of individuals working throughout the government, and those basically supporting nuclear energy in the private sector as well. And that nuclear energy is viewed as necessary to maintain economic prosperity in Japan. However, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster, with the earthquake and subsequent tsunami, led to a number of responses from the Japanese citizenry and counter responses. There were peaceful and orderly protests, according to Ogawa's 2013 article, and the number of people that were showing up for these protests were often underestimated by the police and subsequent reports as well. There was a call during these protests for a call for future generations, so essentially protecting children from nuclear radiation. These types of chants were pretty predominant, according to Ogawa. There was an anti-protest or a counter-protest that was hired by TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company. And essentially what was being shouted in response to protect our children was that the protesters were viewed as unpatriotic. And this is the same term that was used in World War II to refer to people who criticized national policies. And so here you can see this contested space of energy and energy development, and weighing the needs of the current generation with the potential impacts on future generations as well, and how these issues get framed and how they get thought about in terms of things like the next generation, motherhood, parenthood, and then and the counter to that, how this is somehow unpatriotic to express an opinion anti-development of nuclear power plants. So Ogawa notes that these rallies also called for a movement towards renewables, and this led to a broader questioning of the current way of life. In other words, do we really need all of this energy overall? Of course, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident was a level 7 event, the same as Chernobyl. It was not discovered until much later that it was a level 7, or it was not reported until much later that it was a level 7 incident. The film that I made, which is for viewing in this class as well, Chernobyl's Power, Transforming Lives, Fueling the Future, was based on a couple of trips that I made to Ukraine, and one of those trips was just prior to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster, and one of them was immediately after. The first was with a group of Americans, professors and professionals, representing both pro and anti, as well as middle of the road with nuclear power, and assessing the overall need versus the potential risk associated with nuclear power. The first was funded through the Trust for Mutual Understanding and was led by John Perkins at Evergreen State University. The second trip was on my own to look at more of the social and cultural impacts of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. So the film overall looks at the continued impacts of the accident at Chernobyl. And this was, some 25 years later, or 20, actually more, after the incident. at Chernobyl now in 2022, and how although the news stories were not as prevalent, there were still ramifications for what happened at Chernobyl, and not just in the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, but outside that as well. So I got to interview individuals who were personally impacted by this or had family that were personally impacted. Interviews with folks that were pro-nuclear power within Ukraine, and indeed worked for Energoatom, essentially the energy agency in Ukraine. And the discussions were varied about all of the implications, basically the fallout from Chernobyl. And so there were these social and psychological rehabilitation centers that were set up in numerous locations throughout Ukraine. And in one of these, I talked with the director, and she noted that the availability of scientific information for the safety of the general public was still not necessarily there in some instances, in terms of what is safe to consume, in terms of collecting. The other thing that she brought up was the issue of crisis and non-crisis, and who will take action. And so when something actually becomes an issue, Chernobyl was certainly an issue when it was first discovered, not necessarily shared by the Soviet Union at the time, what was happening in Ukraine. But there was actually a discovery of higher levels of radiation, and based on the patterns in the wind and weather in those systems, they had determined that somewhere in Central Europe there had been a nuclear incident. And of course, this was the Chernobyl level 7 disaster incident. There was also the idea of hope for the world, for the children, so that we may all have a future. And so much like the Japanese parents were chanting, this was about future generations. And so decisions made in the current generation need not necessarily adversely impact future generations. And if they do, what accountability do we have for future generations? And I think that's some of the larger issues that we've discussed in this class, not only the impacts that current actions have on differently situated people along the lines of social inequality, but what are the potential ramifications for humanity and non-human animals and non-human life on our planet overall. So lots of big questions here that we've talked about in terms of the state of the world and what potential alternatives look like, utopian versus dystopian frames. And so in the final exam for this class, essentially asking you to think about what the biggest problem is in the world today, and how that problem is maybe changed over time, how it's thought about, how it's addressed, and how should we understand these problems, through which theoretical lens or frame. I've always personally enjoyed anthropology. I'm an anthropologist now because of its holistic perspective. And we talked about that in the very beginning of the semester in these screencasts, the idea that we try to look at every single aspect of issues. It's comparative and evolutionary, so we also look across time. So we look across time, space, and it's field-based. So we go out into the field and we see what's happening, and we get diverse perspectives and bring those in a manner that might not necessarily occur in other settings. And so the question ultimately, what can be done and by whom? And so who should be the actors to address these types of global issues? And a lot of this, of course, is how these issues are framed, and if they're framed in a manner that particular entities are better suited to address these issues or not. And I think that this idea of hope for the future that was expressed towards the end of the film on Chernobyl that I made, I think is a pertinent one in thinking about global issues today, because of course these continue to manifest and take different forms, albeit with some of the same ideological underpinnings, some of the root causes overall. So I hope overall that this class has provided you with some tools and knowledge to enhance your critical thinking and analysis skills, in considering problems at a variety of scales. Thanks.